Hey Gators, so we're taking the time to go from a macro level in our last module, which looked at organizational culture and change management, now to the micro level of interpersonal relationships and specifically handling coworker conflicts. The stuff that we go through in everyday work life that is difficult and challenging. So hopefully you'll find this really useful and give you strategies to think about them differently and hopefully get better outcomes along the way. But before we jump in, we need to go through some truths about this. So first of all, disagreement does not equal unkindness. We need to go back to our personality profiles and recognize that some personality profiles really do not like disagreement. It feels unpleasant, it can feel downright threatening, and we sometimes avoid it, right? Because we just don't want to be bothered by it. It's inconvenient, it seems ineffective, it can generate anger and ultimately sour relationships. And so we just don't even like disagreement to begin with. It's unkind, it's cruel, it's mean, and that's how we feel about it. Contrast that, on the other hand, to some personality types that find disagreement exciting, thrilling, dramatic, a chance to discover new information or solve a problem or reach your goal. That it can be completely completely different. And they don't see it as unkind at all. They just see it as kind of something you have to go through to get to an outcome, right? It's nothing to be afraid of. It's nothing personal. It's just something that needs to be problem solved. That's it. So again, this is where you can identify how you feel about disagreement, if you're more on the one side or the other. But for a lot of people, disagreement does feel like unkindness, and I'm just here to tell you, it really isn't. It really isn't. It's very normal, it's very natural, and we need to move away from the personalization of it into things like job threat and discomfort. So let's look at it as just something we navigate in everyday life. So when we get into workplace conflict, we're talking about all those discussions and deliberations and sometimes downright arguments you have with your coworkers or your boss. Remember back in earlier modules, I said most people don't quit their job, they quit their boss. Okay? So a lot of times leaving a workplace comes down to conflict with coworkers, where you don't feel valued, where you can't get your interests met, and it's rough. So, or your boss and you don't see eye to eye, and finally you've had it, right? So if we can navigate that conflict more successfully, we won't have to do things so drastically like leaving a job that maybe we love. So while some of us enjoy a lively debate with colleagues and others prefer to suppress our feelings over disagreements, we all struggle with conflict at work. Again, part of the natural course of things in work life. So every day we navigate an office full of competing interests, and those might be things like clashing personalities, limited time and resources, and sadly, fragile egos. Sure, but we share the same overarching goals as our colleagues, but we don't always agree on how to achieve them, or maybe what the purpose of them is. We work differently, we rub each other the wrong way, we jockey for position. And again, sometimes what we're after really drives the conflict. Okay, so we have to think about strategies and how to address it. So when we get after addressing conflict, these are things you need to consider. So how can you deal with a conflict at work in a way that is both professional and productive, where it improves both your work and your relationships? So let's stop for a second right there. Realize that during interviewing, it is very common for a hiring manager to do what we call behavioral interviewing, where they ask you to give them an example, tell a story, or suggest some version of events that will illustrate your behaviors and maybe your personality profile, your inclinations, and your approaches to things. Conflict is usually one of them. So you might be asked in an interview, tell me about a disagreement you had with your supervisor. How did you handle it? Or tell me about a time when you failed to reach a deadline on a team with coworkers. What did you do? So again, these are conflicts that come up, and we want to see what happened. So this illustrates creativity, resilience, problem solving, teaming, an analytical mind, nimbleness, all kinds of qualities about an employee. So this is a good way to prepare in advance for an interview that solicits some behavioral interviewing questions to, again, show us some of how you behave in the workplace. So keep that in the back of your head as you prepare for interviews. So to continue, you start by understanding whether you generally seek or avoid conflict. That is key. You have to identify who you are. Identifying the most frequent reasons for disagreement. So this is just getting to know your employer and kind of what kinds of challenges it experiences throughout the day or month or year. And lastly, knowing what approaches work for what scenarios. So you're going to have strategies that are good in some situations, terrible in others. And we'll talk about those in a moment. Then if you decide to address a particular conflict, you use that information to plan and conduct a productive conversation. Again, professional and productive. I always advise students, if you conduct yourself in a professional and productive manner, you will almost never get in trouble. You will almost never have something go the wrong way. But it's hard to delineate, what do we mean by professional and productive? What are we talking about? Well, it comes back to those common core values of using respect, being an active listener, using creativity, not making, blank statements or accusations. It's that kind of stuff that helps you maintain professionality. So that's something that you want to consider. What does it mean to me to be professional? And oftentimes it comes back to good manners and respect. Okay, again, some big truths coming out of this lecture. So conflict is a normal and natural part of organizational culture. It just happens. And there's almost no way to prevent it. Although we use our due diligence to do so, it still just happens. And dealing with conflict is an essential skill, and one, again, that an employer might want to test you on during an interview. So come with those stocks of stories that can illustrate the ways that you were successful. And if you can't think of any, brainstorm with someone that's close to you that maybe can suggest some ideas. Now, some of you may say, I don't have a ton of work experience yet, so how do I come up with a story to illustrate my essential skills of conflict management? Well, you may have some experience navigating group work as a student, maybe working as a volunteer or an intern, but having some kind of responsibility given to you by someone else and maybe some natural things that happened along the process. It's easy to go, oh, I don't have work experience, there's nothing to talk about. But again, brainstorm, be creative, and make a good attempt to answer that question. You'll get better and better at interviewing and coming up with better stories as you go forward. So again, don't be afraid to fail. It's a tough part of life, but improvement is one thing you get out of failure, right? You get new information on how to do something different next time. So some positive outcomes to conflict, which don't get talked about, which really matter. Maybe this can help motivate us to rethinking how we see conflict and going across that line to seeing disagreement as not being equal to unkindness. This might help us with that. So positive outcomes to conflict, you get more successful work results, meeting your goals. Okay, so a lot of times it's about getting to the bottom line, getting past a problem and finally achieving what you're supposed to. So that's ultimately a positive thing, right? Opportunities to learn and grow. It'll stretch us, right? You've heard the cliche, there's no growth in your comfort zone and there's no comfort in your growth zone. Yep, that applies here. So it lets us see things differently and, try things. And sometimes you have to get a little uncomfortable to do that. And that's okay. It's pretty normal, but it helps and we'll often be better for it. It also improves our relationships. And I know some of you are going, really, Jensen? It improves your relationships when you get down to a knockdown, drag out fight? No, we're not talking about that. We talk about improved relationships when you finally get to a solution. So during the way in that journey, you became more and more familiar with managing the challenge and negotiating preferences. There's give and take that comes in these exchanges. And sometimes the exchanges are a little heated, but oftentimes people will grow closer in the process because you know each other better. You've discovered each other's hot buttons and how not to push them. And maybe something important to you that you didn't recognize before. So again, you can actually get improved relationships out of this. Maybe you've heard the expression forming, storming, norming, and performing. So that expression is, forming is the process of coming together on a task. Storming is kind of those natural conflicts that come up when we're trying to figure out how to do the task and who's going to do what and how to conquer this and how to get past that. And it can be very uncomfortable. And then finally, norming is when we've figured out some of those things and we start to work more effectively and efficiently, and we've identified our strengths and we can play to those. And then finally, performing is not only getting to a point of normalcy, but now really beating the competition and excelling to our greatest potential. Okay? So that's a fun one to keep track of. Again, I'll say it one more time. Forming, storming, norming, and performing. We use it with teams all the time, teams of all kinds, whether they're work teams or sports teams or choirs or theatrical troops, or whatever organization you're in. It could be a group of volunteers. It could be people you golf with. I don't know. But when the group is kind of new to each other, you're forming, and then again, you'll discover the conflicts. You'll navigate those conflicts and finally overcome them and get to the best performance, which is ultimately what we're all after, right? Finally, getting to better job satisfaction. You've just gotten past a conflict, so hopefully you're feeling more peace and calm and can enjoy that for a period of time, at least until your next conflict comes up. And hopefully it'll help you feel more skillful and more satisfied, in your job, that now you have skills. You know how to do something. You've accomplished something. And hopefully you get recognized for that accomplishment too. And again, this is an important time to go back to that personality inventory, because some of us need recognition more than others. Some of us need a little bit of stroking or heavy-handed compliments, and others really don't want that spotlight. We would prefer to stay in the background. But ultimately, again, that job satisfaction of successfully navigating a conflict is true for everybody. So conflict resolution, these are the things we're talking about. So hopefully you'll get some good advice and, again, kind of research-based recommendations that you need to understand the most common sources of conflict, explore your options for addressing a disagreement, recognize whether you and your counterpart typically seek or avoid conflict, prepare for and engage in a difficult conversation, manage you or your counterpart's emotions, develop a resolution together, and also know when to walk away. Unfortunately, that's a way we deal with conflict, and we don't like to do it that way, but sometimes we have to. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about when we talk about conflict resolution. Okay, so getting into conflict approaches. We want to, we already talked about this, I believe. Yep. I'm going to skip ahead. Okay. The conflicts that we talk about are, again, interpersonal issues we run into all the time in business. And these are the kinds of disagreements we tend to see the most often. So the what, or the task, okay, or the how, the process of work, how to get there. And then the who is ultimately responsible, and that gets into status. So we talk about status as kind of leadership, or who makes the call. And again, these often devolve into relationship conflicts, right? Where we're stepping all over each other's toes, and some people are more keyed in on task, other people are more keyed in on process, and others are more keyed in on status. So again, time to go back to your personality inventory. Which one would you probably be more focused on? And this can give you some information about maybe how conflict works for you. Okay. So sometimes the system creates the conflict, not the people. So this is something to recognize, almost kind of a nod back to organizational culture and change management, like we talked about earlier. People are good. In my experience, most people can be trusted. Most people are good and have good intentions, and you'll get further by trusting rather than by not. They all operate in the system in which they have, right? And sometimes we're tempted to do things we shouldn't do, but by and large, I think we all tend to do the right thing. This way of thinking through conflicts really tries to depersonalize them, and it makes it about modifying the system instead of modifying people. So at the very onset, look at your conflict and say, wait a minute, is this a product of a system or is this a product of a person? And if you can identify it's a system, then that is huge. You now have a way to go about that conflict, and you can refrain from those personal attacks, which can really backfire, right? Okay. So let's talk about a theory of constraints. These go into things that are organizational culture, business theory, but this is kind of generally what we talk about when we say theory of constraints. What we're talking about is conflicts come about because our situations drive us to take actions that appear to be incompatible. And if we can understand what is driving those actions and we have a common goal or objective, then there is likely a path forward to resolving the conflict in a way that satisfies both parties. But the whole key is to recognize our drives, recognize the incompatibility of the situation across different counterparts or different actors, and identify the common goal or objective. Okay, so again, recognizing the constraints, working within them, and using the common goal as glue to push us ahead. That's what we talk about when we talk about a theory of constraints. Again, really good, thoughtful process stuff you want to do before you approach conflict. And I know some of you are thinking, really, Jensen, some of these conflicts come up in the moment, and what can I do on the fly? I can't go back to my PowerPoint lecture from my professor and say, oh, what's theory of constraints? I'm in the moment. I got to solve this now because it's timely. It's happening in front of my face. What do I do? We will talk about that. That's coming closer to the end of the lecture. So you will see that. And that is not falling on deaf ears, I promise. Okay. So let's move into avoiders and seekers. Okay. So again, avoiders and seekers are kind of our approach to conflict. Right? Are we the people that, really don't want to deal with conflict? We avoid it. Or do we be like, yeah, bring it on. We're competitive and we seek it because it's exciting and it's fun. There is not a good and a bad here. Both have good and bad tendencies. Both have upsides and downsides. Okay. But it is important to identify which side of the spectrum you fall on. Okay. So are you an avoider? Are you a seeker? This one's tough for me. I tend to be a little bit of both. So let's break it down a little bit more so I can kind of put myself on one side versus the other, and you can as well. So again, these are the conflict approaches. Let's start with avoiders. So avoiders value relationship harmony. They often placate themselves. They change the topic. They hide from the tension. They appear passive, and they feel uncomfortable. Okay? So again, these are kind of some of the things that they're about and things that maybe don't work out so well for them. Contrast that to the other side, the seekers. Seekers will value directness and honesty. They advocate for themselves. They can be impatient. They lean into the challenge, but they appear aggressive and they feel fascinated. Okay? So when you look at this list, you go, wow, I don't know. Am I an avoider or a seeker? It's not perfectly clear all the time. And sometimes it depends on the conflict. Sometimes it's the type of conflict that we go, I'm more of a seeker in that situation than I am an avoider. Or no, that one's definitely an avoider. It also depends on the relationship. You may be an avoider of conflict when it comes to conflicts with your loved ones, with your romantic partner. You may be more of a seeker when it comes to conflicts at work, one with your boss or a coworker. Over a process or a product. Okay. So it could change by situation, but again, recognizing if we're avoiding or seeking is an important first step. There generally are 4 types of conflict when we talk about organizational culture. So we have relationship conflict. Those are those interpersonal conflicts that sometimes get into personalities and get really heated. There's task conflict, which is really more on the job in front of us, right? Whether or not to do it. Whether it's worth doing, if it's important. The process, the how to do it, right? So we look at the best approach, the best way, and sometimes we get into very heated discussions about that. And then the status, right? Who makes the call, who gets the glory, and, am I going to be recognized for my efforts? So that can create conflict as well. Here's the deal. Conflicts rarely fall into one category. Often you will find multiple going on at one time. So keep that in mind. It's not just, I'm in this box, I'm in that box. It doesn't work like that. Often relationship conflicts go hand in hand with status ones, right? Where we feel people using their authority to be dominant and we don't like it. Or we feel that competition, or, we feel distrust, or we feel threat. Oftentimes, task and process conflicts go together too, where we talk about that process is so antiquated, or that process is so inefficient, it takes too long. Is this job really worth doing? Or I procrastinated, and it's because I don't like the process. I don't like the task. I don't like the job, right? So they can go together. Or maybe relationship and process, right? So-and-so is not good at a detail-oriented process like that. They can't keep track of what's necessary to keep things going. Or maybe it gets into status and task. That is below me to do that. I am too good to take out the trash. I am too good to clean the toilet, even though we all have to take turns doing it. I'm the boss, or I've worked here a long time, and I shouldn't have to do those piddly tasks, right? So that happens too. And I've had some funny situations with that one coming up. It's kind of funny. Okay. When we get into the conflict, the type of conflict, again, relationship conflict has to do with personal issues, right? These are those personal arguments and sometimes the personality clashes that we've talked about earlier. Also, we talk about task, the goal you're trying to achieve. Maybe there's disagreement on that, about what it's for and why. And that can be huge because that can derail an entire department of people trying to figure out what to do, right? That's a big one. Process is really more about how the work gets done and the best way to do it. And sometimes the best way is not the efficient way, but maybe it's the way that keeps employee morale high, or the way that requires less training and less time to get it done, but maybe the quality's a little lower. It's hard because we make concessions all the time. Sometimes the process drives some other outcome we're not familiar with, and then we go back to task. Well, what is the goal? Is the goal to keep the employees happy or meet the deadline? What are we talking about here? And then finally, status. You are in the group who is in charge, or you're not. You're being told what to do. We all like to self-determine our own lives and be empowered. And this is a real common source of conflict, right? Especially between a subordinate and a supervisor. So that comes up all the time. Or people that aren't your supervisor, but they're acting like they are. Yeah, those people are a lot of fun, aren't they? Where they're kind of telling you what to do. Or maybe they're in charge of you on a project, but you don't really report to them. And you don't really like interacting with them. They're not very pleasant. You guys don't get along very well, and it's really awkward. That can happen as well. We're going to stop here for now, and we'll pick up with the rest of the lecture in part 2.